Of the North African city of Hippo, was one of the greatest church thinkers, church fathers, and early Christian thinkers. His dates were 354 to 430. And as we look in this week at how Christianity developed from the time of Jesus and the time of the first apostles, like the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter, we have to take in what the essence of Christian spirituality was, in addition to all the political intrigues and disputes over texts and so on. Augustine led a life that drew him away from early Christian teaching. He followed the ways of the world in his own language in his book Confessions and other religious teachings. But in his early 30s, he came to Christian faith. And here is one of his most famous sayings: "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." The sense of searching, finding nothing that would satisfy. This was Augustine's deep experience. And then of coming home, ultimately, and rest in the God he found in the Christian faith. We are indeed in week 9 of Western religions and Western religion Christianity, the last week in these religions of confrontation or encounter. This week I want to look at what are called non-canonical texts. If you read some of the same social media feeds or watch the same YouTube videos, etc., like I do, you'll hear about these texts that were not included in the Bible. When the Bishop Athanasius wrote up his famous letter in 367, you'll know that many texts that were held, at least by certain communities of followers of Jesus as the Christ, that they were not held to be ultimately standards of belief. So what about these other texts that are not in the Bible? The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, Pistis Sophia. To understand these may help us understand the diversity of early Christianity, or what the University of North Carolina scholar and well-known author Bart Ehrman calls the diversity of Christianities. The most important is the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the writings or codices from the collection called the Nag Hammadi literature. It has recognized fragments of sayings that most scholars would say go back to Jesus himself, and not, for example, in these other texts like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Peter, where they are revelations given or recorded by a later follower of the teachings of Jesus. These seem to go back to words that were actually given by Jesus and then passed on. So they were found at Nag Hammadi, which is 200 miles south of Cairo. It's a treasure trove of Gnostic texts. Let me first tell you about the finding of these texts, and then I'll tell you about Gnosticism. Scholars first became aware of this Nag Hammadi library in 1946. So imagine the time. It's just after the ending of the Second World War. People are beginning to put back the various world powers and their countries, perhaps searching for some new insights. At least we can imagine it that way. Making careful inquiries from 1947 to 1950, Jean Dorès discovered that a Bedouin, a wandering, a Bedouin farmer, shall we say, peasant, dug up the text from a graveyard in the desert located in this area of Nag Hammadi. This Bedouin, interestingly enough, is Muhammad Ali al-Samam. Muhammad Ali, a local farmer and Bedouin. These are 52 texts that were found in this area, but they include some texts that weren't only Gnostic, like Plato's Republic and so on. But this is a fascinating story of blood feuds, cannibalism, but especially superstitions about jinns or genies or spirits. There's even a story that at one point, when as they were looking into the dirt, their axe or hit something that cracked, and they found these jars with these texts, and because they were cold at night, they burned some of the texts they found. At any rate, the Oxford Companion to the Bible talks about these in this way. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945 and 46, 1945, gradually made available between 1956 and 77, contains some 40 previously unknown documents together with copies of several texts already known. Fragments used to stiffen the binding of some of these codices suggest a date of about the middle of the 4th century of the Common Era, but the Greek originals from which these Coptic texts were translated probably go back in some cases to the 2nd century of the Common Era. And listen to this. The library's significance for the study of some aspects of early Christianity is comparable with that of the Dead Sea Scrolls for Judaism of an earlier period. So really fascinating, amazing stories behind it. And it contains primarily a trove of Gnostic texts. So Gnosticism was a movement based on the idea of secret knowledge, or in Greek, gnosis. So the idea that there was some knowledge that would bring enlightenment. And here we're coming closer to a kind of Eastern religious tradition, which often does not emphasize salvation, but enlightenment. At any rate, in Gnosticism, the idea often was that the body was bad and the spirit was good. So they tended to what would be called a dualism, two different entities, body and spirit. Material world as well was bad, and the spirit world, the world in which there are spiritual realities, is good. This is one way of understanding how evil enters the world. So there's this divine spark in all human beings, but as it comes into this world, it gets imprisoned in the limitations, in the temptations of the material body. So the whole idea is to become unclothed from the body. This, by the way, is very Platonic, which is probably why Plato's writings were found in this literature. By the way, this literature may have come from a nearby monastery that treasured these texts as part of their ascetic practice. But when the official list of the canon was laid down, perhaps they were hidden so they'd be preserved to be found later. So it's possibly written in about 140 of the Common Era, almost certainly in the 2nd century, although the earliest fragment, the actual fragment that scholars have, is from about 200 of the Common Era. So remember, these texts were passed down orally before they were written down. So there are many scholars, again, that believe some of these texts are as old as the New Testament Gospels, but they are siphoned through through Gnosticism. Here are some passages to consider. Let me highlight them and then I'll read them for you. The Logian. There are 114 logia, or sayings. They're just sayings. There's not very much narrative around it. There's no death and resurrection like you see in the Gospels of the Bible. But in these logia, these 114 logia or sayings, we find very interesting things. There's the problem of the body, in quote, becoming naked, end of quote. In 42, there's the idea of becoming passers-by. In Logian 47, we see something very close to what we see in the canonical or biblical Gospels. In 54, similarly, we see the saying, blessed are the poor. In the 77th saying, there are hints of pantheism, that God is present everywhere. And in 114, there may be elements of misogyny. All right, let's look at those more closely. Number 37 will be our first Logian. The disciples said, when will you become revealed to us, And when shall we see you? Jesus said, when you disrobe without being ashamed, and take up your garments and place them under your feet like little children and tread on them, then you will see the Son of the living one, and you will not be afraid. The garments are probably the body. It's letting go of the body that's important. And Jesus says in saying 42, become passers-by. Just passing through this world is what he means. In 47, he says a saying that is very similar to Jesus as to what is recorded in Matthew 6. No one can serve two masters, for he will either hate the one and serve and love the other. So here in Gospel of Thomas, he says, it is impossible for a man to mount two horses or to stretch two bows. It is impossible for a servant to serve two masters, otherwise he will honor the one and treat the other contemptuously. No man drinks old wine and immediately desires to drink new wine. And new wine is not put into old wineskins lest they burst, nor is old wine put into a new wineskin lest it spoil it. An old patch is not sewn under a new garment because a tear would result. And this saying 54 is very similar to what we read in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew and chapter 6 of the Gospel of Luke. Jesus said, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. And then here we get a little bit of pantheism. Jesus said, it is I who am the light, who is above them all. It is I who am the all. Ta panta in Greek, the all. That is a saying that's in Gnostic texts of sort of the fullness of everything, the mystery behind it all. It is I who am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. And here's the pantheism. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there. Simon Peter said to him, in saying 1:14, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Interesting. Is that misogyny, or is it instead a way of saying that a woman can become like a man, like a person who sits at the feet of the rabbi and listens and has a right to do so?